Hello, I'm going to present lecture L-T8 on meaning in architectural form, part 4 for 25th November 2021. Meaning in architectural form series, continuing with looking into architectural precedents, particular architects and their buildings and their philosophies. And today we will be focusing on contemporary architecture examples, on new expressionism with Rem Koolhaas, OMA, Zaha Hadid, Coop Himmelblau, and Gehry. Sometime in 1988, there were, under MoMA, or the Museum of Modern Art in New York, there was an exhibition on deconstructivist architecture for the first time. This was called that name. And Philip Johnson, the architect and former director of the Department of Architecture and Design, the Museum of Modern Art, in association with Mark Wigley and others, organized it. So basically, in the gist of it is that they were excited about the works of some architects. At that time, 7 international architects, apart from those whom I mentioned, include as well Peter Eisenman, then Daniel Libeskind, Bernard Schumi. So you can also find out about those architects. And the quote here is interesting, that these architects recognize the imperfectibility of the modern world and seek to address, in Johnson's words, the pleasures of unease, obsessed with diagonals, arcs, and warped planes. They intentionally violate the cubes and right angles of modernism. Their projects continue the experimentation with structure initiated by the Russian constructivists, but the goal of perfection of the 1920s is subverted. The traditional virtues of harmony, unity, and clarity are displaced by disharmony, fracturing, and mystery. The word mystery will also crop up later in one of the works. And in general, this actually describe the works that they just call deconstructivist work, and some call it deconstruction. And we have seen postmodernism, architecture, exploration earlier, but in this particular one, this is very exciting times at that time. That was many years ago, but now it's become something that is quite common already. But these are the protagonists of that movement, these architects, yeah? Sometimes you call them star architects because they have their own signature. So, but we go to Rem Koolhaas, like with Zaha Hadid, they were teaching at the Architectural Association School. At that time, Rem Koolhaas is one of the principal of Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA. He founded it, and he's from Holland or Netherlands. So they have designed many famous architecture like Jesu Library, Netherlands Embassy, and Seattle Central Library. So for example, in this case of the Jesu Library, the technique that OMA use are based on intersection of horizontal and vertical loops that manipulated to connect with each floor by using a wood with above and below levels. So it became seamless connectivity all around this library based on, there was a conceptual model which he opened up like an origami, yeah? But in terms of the implementation, it's quite difficult to maintain good gradient, but it's quite consistent that he uses ramps in his work, in many of his other works, like the Netherlands Architecture Institute in Rotterdam. So you can check out the links below further. One of his works, which is quite controversial at the time in Porto, Portugal, is Casa de Musica, in which the context around the heritage buildings around, suddenly you have this sort of a massive, not cube, but some amorphous form. And if you were to go there, even the landscape is a bit skewered and the building will be revealed slowly, and you can enter to the certain floor right through the lobby area where they have all the auditoriums or the concert halls, yeah? Or you can enter below, and then you can't really feel the context when you're in there, obviously, and it's the issue of bigness is being addressed by what Rem Koolhaas wrote in his book SMLXL, 1995. The bigness or the problem of large. You have these types of buildings like concert halls and museums and the new ones especially, and how do you actually address the context in them? Because when you get into them, it's like almost like a whole city in itself due to the size of it, yeah, a small village or a small entity of itself to discover. So he scrutinized the antagonism between big and small in the city, and he tried to mediate between the two, the big and small. And there is this some ambiguity with regard to this sort of architecture. So I will go into the principles of bigness, because it's big, it have its own programming inside, yeah. So it could be independent of the will of its architects. This is what Rem Koolhaas argued in his book, which is one of the books that people read for architecture theory. It's complex in its way, and that this one is an interesting point that he said because it is big, and between big and not very big but big enough, the circulation is random, and you short circuit the distance, you artificialize the interiors, you reduce the massing, you maybe stretch the dimensions, accelerate the construction, the elevator, electricity, air conditioning, steel. And finally, the new infrastructures form a cluster of mutation that induce another species of architecture. So his argument is that you can't compare this with traditional architecture or those buildings before. So he justified in his architecture that he has, which have a lot of programs. So these are the points, and at the end you mentioned about what he's trying to say about the theory of bigness. And in one of his books called Delirious New York, The Theory of Bigness, that's earlier than the other book. The subtext or the message you're trying to say is a bad word regarding context. So as we know that they're different than the others before, in which they even Peter Eisenman was doing a certain measure, a certain formula with his architecture using mathematical configurations, not thinking about the context. So, but this one really, when they are in building it, they conceive it as not referring to the context, maybe very subtly, but not at all. So there are these points here. The issues are, there's certain things about the theory of bigness that you have to address. A mass can no longer be controlled by a single architectural gesture or even by a combination of architectural gestures, but the parts remain committed to the whole. Number two, the elevator, when you talk about mechanical, our reliance on mechanical vertical circulation. So when you talk about composition, scale, proportion, detail, it is secondary because of this circulation. And then number three is the distance between the core and envelope increase to the point where the facade no longer reveal what happens inside. So you see the facade from the outside, but you don't know what's inside. So there is this mystery that he mentioned about where architecture reveals, bigness perplexes. Bigness transforms the city from a summation of certainties into an accumulation of mysteries. What you see is no longer what you get. So, these are some of the points. And number four, through size alone, such buildings enter an amoral domain beyond good or bad. So their impact is independent of their quality. What does that mean? I don't know. So it is trying to go and tease us with these words. And then the number five is based on this, the subtext is not to regard context. Together, all these breaks with scale, with architecture, composition, with tradition, with transparency, with ethics imply the final, most radical break. Bigness is no longer part of any urban tissue. So, so that was what Rem Koolhaas wrote, and this is some of his buildings. The N Hotel in Rotterdam and the CCTV in China. And again, you talk about bigness and about, not having to deal with the context much, only subtly, and having the building as its own architecture and mystery and so on. So this is what Rem Koolhaas is trying to write in that book to justify his architecture. So he don't talk about art, yeah, but there will be an architect that talks about architecture as art. So with regard to Zaha Hadid, she went through many phases, a Pritzker Prize winning architect, and she's also a fashion designer, very much also an artist, and very much is one of the star architects, one of the most sought after architects, but she has passed away. And Zaha Hadid architects are headed by Patrick Schumacher. So their criticism about her work, sensuous curved forms, which she was known in parametricism, but it hasn't only been that. So I'm going to show you her earlier work. And this is on the left is her design, her thesis project in Architecture Association, which there is a link where she talked about how she was influenced by Malevich, which was the Russian constructivist artist, yeah, and this somehow went into her exploration on fragmentation and those suprematist ideas of floating, fragmented elements. And in fact, on the left is, it actually was not built, but this was quite a provocative painting where she took precedents from the existing Hong Kong urbanscape, and that connected to her reasoning how she created the Peak Clubhouse in Hong Kong. Very much the designers on the right. So this is also similar to what she's been doing earlier on in the Vitra fire station, which is one of her earlier works, where it's connected more to suprematist tendencies of the floating elements that seems to be floating, and shards and fragments and so on. This is now a museum. It's not a full-fledged fire station, but more of a museum to show some fire trucks. Also, how does one deal with the context is that you also fragmentize the context in the sense of making it a drawing. Yeah, the context is just a piece of drawing that look into the topography or the contours of the land, and then this was the inspiration for the Vitra fire station earlier. So Lebbeus Woods, one of the architects who, the contemporary and also part of the group, talk about how that two separate sets of possible reasons he felt not entirely conflicting. The first, that over 10 years between the Peak clubhouse in Hong Kong and the Vitra fire station, Hadid's thinking had evolved in a natural way, because the Peak was more of a drawing and it wasn't built. There was a lot of hype over it, but it never got built. But the Vitra fire station was built. So between that 10 years, because she's very much a lecturer or a tutor in AA school, and at the same time, she was very influential to a lot of other people as well, and was influenced by Rem Koolhaas as well. So Hadid's thinking had evolved in a natural way, following a trajectory from utopian visions of ideal Hadidian world to a Hadidian interpretations of the world as it actually is. So I don't know what that means really, but it is much more her imagination other than other references. So his second point is that a gradual acceptance of the fact that she wanted to build her designs would have to work within property lines and other limitations, material and conceptual imposed by clients. So as you see, the Peak clubhouse is very much beyond the boundaries, and the question is whether it can be built. Then the Vitra fire station was built, so she became much more rationalized in a way, although she still kept to her ideas of those influences that she got from suprematism and Russian constructivism. So that's why he's mentioning it here. So later, this impacted her development in the 90s and growing and preeminence of the computer in the architecture, design, and construction. Not only architects, but clients, engineers, and contractors expected to see computer drawings that could be readily exchanged between them and directly translated to computer-aided manufacture of building elements. So maybe it became more and more that it's easier to do parametricism on computer. And so that became a dramatic shift from the shards and fragments into parametricism and those fluid forms. So the curvilinear fluid dynamic forms also can be drawn in, with conventional hand methods. In fact, Zaha Hadid always draw her design from the beginning. It's always like an art piece. So when he mentioned about French curves, it is a sort of an equipment that people use before there is computers to get those curves. So because there's computer, then it's easily to be drawn. So they became like a big company and they did other projects. And that is a story of, more or less a story of her development from suprematist Russian constructivist influence to parametricism. This is another example of Zaha Hadid architecture work. This is less of the parametric one. This more still very much sharp and object driven and angular, angular, and the character, and how this interesting, this architecture, which is actually an extension to the historical building that you can see in the elevation, and how it's interpreted, that structure is interpreted on the right inside of the building, how the structure, the columns are in the hall of the old building, and how it affects the old building's environment, yeah, or transform it into that sort of space. We go to the third protagonist, which is the Coop Himmelblau. Wolf Pricks is the name of the person representing Coop Himmelblau in this manner. So right from the 2001 International Competition for a Natural History Museum in Lyon, the museum was envisioned as a medium for the transfer of knowledge and not as a showroom for products. So the building ground of the museum for Coop Himmelblau, in this case, in Lyon, is located on a peninsula that was artificially extended 100 years ago and situated in the confluence of the Rhone and the Saône rivers. Even though it was apparent that this site would be a difficult one, 536 meter long piles had to be skillfully driven to the ground. It was clear that the location would be very important for the urban design. The building should serve as a distinctive beacon and entrance for the visitors approaching from the south, as well as starting point for urban development. So it's a project that very much shapes the urban context of this city, and very near the dock. And how the Coop Himmelblau, they talk about the existing datum or the base, and then you can have a plinth, and then you have clouds and crystals. So the way they form the architecture is based on this analogies, yeah, or symbolism, and how they would combine them all together in angular forms and shapes. And one of the things that Coop Himmelblau, this is an example, the earlier example of how Coop Himmelblau started on the right, which is an extension on the roof of a building, is the idea of the imaginary hand. You know, your hand, if this is something that is the original structure, and how the hand is perched, you know, how, okay, this is solid, so it's like, you know, gripping it and so on. So when you look at that, you can see that it was in their sketches, in the earlier sketches by the architect, that they're into this. This is in 1983 to 1992. This text was found. An icon of deconstructivist architecture, the Open House Project, appeared in 1984 on the cover of the catalog entitled Architecture is Now. The Open House demonstrates the concept of an open architecture proposed by Coop Himmelblau. Open architecture does not mean that the house has no windows, doors, or that it is transparent. For us, open architecture means an open mind. Reconnecting with the automatic writing of the surrealists, the house grew out of a sketch done with closed eyes called a psychogram, a spontaneous process in which the hand, functioning like a seismograph, records and transcribes the strong feelings and emotions that the future building must rekindle. To build, therefore, consists of retaining the energy of the original sketch. Facades and sections, interiors and exterior, are imagined at the same time and are superposed like X-ray views. So, so this is more, they talk about it more and more about how it is in terms of the counter or how the forms is formed in a way that they would distort it and assemble in a singular configuration. So these are some of the architecture languages that Coop Himmelblau would talk about when they talk about their design. So they're also a star architect, already well known in the beginning. in the 80s, they were all struggling like how Zaha Hadid was. In fact, Coop Himmelblau built earlier than Zaha Hadid. So we assume that architecture does not have and is not meaning, does not have and is not meaning. So it is the three-dimensional presentation of a building problem and thus the solution, in as much as there is a solution. To make the usable areas as large and economical as possible, projects are conceived first as a basic shell, which users can appropriate and improve. Making visible the possibilities and their variations makes the outer gestalt of the complex identifiable. The inner gestalt differentiates, it does not define. We do not view existing structures as fixed realities in terms of content or form. We see them as empty shells. So the form is less identified than Zaha Hadid, if you were to compare, or Rem Koolhaas even, the form is less identified here, and it doesn't have any fix. So it's much more look like as if it is always changing and evolving, yeah? And so is content here. So they see it as empty shells, as spaces that no longer need to be built because they are already there. So interventions are thereby neither playful nor dialectical. Instead, they merely serve the purpose of spatial organization. So we go to the last, but not least, Frank Gehry. So this is one of the earlier projects by Frank Gehry. It's actually his house extension. He tried to use everyday material and compose or decompose or deconstruct the form of the house to be of different elements, all being playfully done. So he is the architect of the iconic Guggenheim Museum, Bilbao, where Philip Johnson called the greatest building of our time. And there are others like the Foundation Louis Vuitton in Paris. Gehry has proven time again that he can create whimsical design. So we go, this is his house in Santa Monica in 1978. Recall the other New York 5 and California Grays. Gehry was doing it at the time, but I could not pinpoint him to be either one of them. Obviously, it's not white. She doesn't use cardboard architecture, white plastered ones. And also, though he's in California, he's not as the same contemporary as the Grays. So in the Frank Gehry's house, the project wrapped an existing bungalow in angular volumes clad in a riot of everyday suburban materials like plywood and chain link. So it's like people didn't like it. So Frank Gehry also did a Vitra design museum, and there were simple geometric forms, again, cubic volume, but only in Bilbao, Spain, when there was a chance to use computer-aided design that he came into prominence. And with this architecture on the right, yeah, that's the Vitra Design Museum on the left, much more volumetric, and it was the same time as Zaha Hadid's Vitra fire station. So a few of the architects did different Vitras, different buildings. So he did a design museum or a museum. So the one on the right is totally he was able to do it based on the CATIA or CATIA IBM computer-aided design program. So he came up with this folding and curvilinear forms of a building to create an icon for the city of Bilbao in 1997. So this is really the early days of exploration of this sort of architecture by these architects, including Frank Gehry. So Gehry sees architecture as an art. Okay, he's straightforward. He's a corporate architect. He has He's a star architect, and people come to him like the other three architects, yeah? Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, and Wolf Pricks of Coop Himmelblau, and the other ones as well, mentioned earlier, Peter Eisenman, and the two others that I mentioned earlier, Bernard Schumi, and another one. Peter Eisenman, yeah. Okay, so all of them are star architects. People seek for their signature design. So Frank Gehry is regarded as one of the masters and one of the most prominent architects in America and elsewhere. So Frank Gehry manipulates the constraints of the project and expresses it. The building cannot be faceless like in modernism. So he approached each building as a sculptural object, each piece of architecture as a painting. So many of these projects that you've seen here are it's big, there's the bigness to it, and they are prominent buildings in the landscape of the city. The city mayor or corporations, they want them to design their style in that city to bring it as a tourist product or maybe an icon so that people would visit the city. So, so you have to have an approach where you as a star architect, your signature building is based on some sort of a strong statement. So for Gehry, he sees architecture as an art. So his inspiration comes from art, and his role model are artists. So you have Zaha Hadid as well. She's an artist, and every design is preceded by a drawing that she does. So they would say that Gehry's design is like a cubist artist. And remember Cubism? So if Cubism were to be 3D or sculptural, maybe that is the result on the right, yeah, or on the left. So there is no ugly or pretty or no right or wrong in this process. Gehry's architecture has no real rules, is open-ended and experiential architecture like art. So that's a quotation either in his own words or what somebody believes that his work's like. So you could check out with these links below. So that is all for lecture L-T8. Thank you very much.